Welcome everyone to chesslecture.com. I'm International Master William Paschall. Today I'm starting a series on Petrosian on the King's Indian attack. Tigran Petrosian, the late world champion, not to be confused with the modern Tigran Petrosian, also a grandmaster, but the original Tigran Petrosian, former world champion, was a fantastic and extraordinary player, a great positional strategic player, but also he was very, very good in King's Indian type of positions, both with white and black. So basically he would play the black side of the King's Indian, which was very popular in his era, basically his prime between the 40s and the 70s, and he transferred these ideas also into his play with white, using the King's Indian attack. Now I'm 100% sure that Petrosian and other Soviet players of this era were influential in perhaps influencing young Bobby Fischer to take up the King's Indian attack in his own games, because Fischer was a connoisseur of Soviet chess paraphernalia, magazines and books. He used to read Russian magazines, and he definitely picked up the King's Indian attack at a young age. We see a lot of parallels between the young Robert Fischer and Tigran Petrosian in handling the white side of the King's Indian attack. And I've chosen some, I think, excellent example games for handling the white side of the King's Indian attack, a la Tigran Petrosian. So, without further ado, this is part one. We're going to take a look at the game Petrosian versus Uwe. This is from a very important tournament, the Candidates Tournament in Zurich, Switzerland in 1953. So, Tigran Petrosian is white and Max Uwe is black. Petrosian played many different openings with white. Especially he would play d4, e4, English opening. Basically he could play everything. But I really, really appreciate the white side of the King's Indian attack, the way the Petrosian handled it. Now, Uwe plays knight f6. Obviously when you play something like knight f3, you give black a really wide range of options. You have to kind of play it by ear, but we can always play a King's Indian attack type of line. Now, after g3, black has a lot of options. He can play Sicilian style, King's Indian style, he can play Queen's Indian style, he can play even b5, going into the Polish defense. So there's just a lot of possibilities, but you've got your setup, you've got your standard King's Indian type of attack. The beauty of this system for white, I think the number one beauty of it, is that generally speaking, when you fianchetto the king's side bishop, the king's bishop if you want to say, it generally leads to a fairly solid king side position. The fianchettoed side king castling is usually a very safe king for white. So g3 now, d5. Uwe answers classically here. We play bishop g2, and now bishop f5. Bishop f5, I think in today's era, particularly interesting. We do see a lot of c6 played first, and there are some differences. I mean, I think that modern players may prefer, instead of bishop f5, to in fact play c6 here, which does a couple of things. It would negate the power of the bishop on g2. It would also maybe try to talk white out of active plans involving a c4, trying to influence the center, Reti style. So that might be a tiny bit more accurate for black. But nevertheless, a London system type of setup with bishop f5. And now I think personally the sharpest way for white to play here would be c4. But Petrosian interested in playing more of like a traditional kind of King's Indian setup. So he plays d3. And with this move, we're usually aiming for knight on bd2 and e4. Uwe plays e6, white plays knight on bd2. Again, white could do other things here. You can certainly castle kingside. I'm not really sure why Petrosian is necessarily delaying castling in this position. He's aiming for e4, creating a strong point in the center. White could also play c4 in this position. White could also play b3 with the idea of a double fianchetto type of setup. But I think the most flexible move for white would be castles. Moving forward, so Petrosian here playing knight on bd2. This is kind of like a classical King's Indian attack. In modern King's Indian play, if you look at it from Black's perspective, just talking about the King's Indian type of setup in general, many times Black would typically play maybe knight a6 instead of knight on b to d2. But in that sense, he wouldn't be blocking the bishop on c1, leaving his pieces free to move. But that's more in like typical King's Indian type of setups. In this London system type of setup, the knight almost always goes to d2, where it can support e4, try to fight for this strong point. Petrosian, a big believer in the strong point. If you follow his games, and I recommend you do go over all of Petrosian's games, there are many of them, he had a very long career, you'll see how much he really values and benefits from overprotection of the strong point. Big believer. If you look at his games, particularly in the King's Indian attack, check out how important it is to Petrosian to really control the strong point in the position. So, knight on bd2, h6. This move is not mandatory for Black, but Black wants to give that bishop a retreat square back to h7 in this position. So he can hide on h7, not allow the bishop to be captured by a knight. However, it is a closed position. It's possible to give the bishop up for a knight without a great concession. Castles, and now bishop c5. This move is certainly reasonable for Black, but I think it's a bit ambitious. More traditional would be just putting the bishop on e7. Bishop c5 is more aggressive. It's almost like Black's trying to lure White into extending himself with d4. The bishop does end up exposed and loses a tempo at one point. So I think I would prefer c6 or bishop e7 for Black. One thing you do have to be careful and watch out for to take advantage of if you're White here, if Black were to put the bishop on d6, he's vulnerable to piece forks based on e4 and e5. So keep in mind, the one place that bishop doesn't usually belong in a London system when you have a flexible King's Indian structure with d3 is on d6 because of the piece fork e4, e5. So the aggressive bishop c5, and now in this position, Petrosian played queen e1. This is a standard King's Indian attack move. It's still used today, but analysts said that he should have played here e4. This was actually sharper. It is possible due to tactics to get this in. Basically, the idea would be something like d takes e, knight takes e4, and then this intermezzo move, knight h4. Hitting the bishop on f5, hitting the knight on e4, but opening the long diagonal with pressure against b7, probably the single most important factor here. And suddenly Black is actually in serious trouble. Why is this the case? Most likely because Black did not take the time to play the move c6, which I mentioned early on. Around move 3, modern players in this type of setup tend to play c6 prior to playing bishop f5 or bishop to g4. So if we go back to the game, Petrosian did not play as sharply as he could have with e4 there. Instead he played queen e1, which is going to force through e4, castles, and now e4. And this forces Black to make a concession. He gives up his strong point in the center. D takes e. That's good for us. Now I think here objectively, under normal circumstances, I would take with the pawn. I would take with the pawn because taking with the pawn will keep the pieces on the board. White has more space, and White really wants to keep pieces on the board when he has a space advantage. But in this particular instance, because of the bishop on c5, Petrosian decides that he can take advantage of that hit on the bishop on c5 and force Black to take back. So knight takes e4. There are nasty tactics again based on bishop, believe it or not. Bishop takes b7. Because if you retreat here with bishop e7, knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, and the very unpleasant knight h4 would threaten to win material or garner the bishop pair. So it's not really good for Black to allow that. He has to exchange on e4. Knight takes e4, and then d takes e4. Now unfortunately for White, he has allowed an exchange of pieces, which reduces his attacking potential a little bit. But on the positive side, black no longer has a strong point on d5, and white has a strong pawn on e4. Another possibility here is that white could move the queen up to e2 and take control of the open file. I think that white has a tiny advantage here. But check out the other feature of this position that's very interesting. Bishop h7, and now look at this, b4. This move is only possible because the queen is on e1. Petrosian very alert, but he finds a way to gain time, to develop his pieces very quickly. Yes, it's a slightly weakening move, but it's worth it to gain the time here. Now, black could have played bishop to b6 in this position, but I think that he was concerned that the bishop could be attacked further by c4, c5, and decided the bishop was safer on e7, but that leaves him with a problem with the queen. We can call this like a bad queen. Sometimes that piece simply doesn't really have a good place to go. If it's attacked along the d file, it'll have to go to e8 or c8. Some kind of square where it simply hides, it's rather inactive. I guess e8 would be better in this type of situation if it is attacked, to attack the a4, e8 diagonal. Bishop b2. Pressure on g7, nothing immediate, but down the line it will be significant. Watch what happens here. Knight a6, desperately getting the pieces out, but the knight is poorly placed on a6. Simply a3, and now c6. Finally, he's guarding the potential attacks down the long diagonal, Uwe that is, also giving his knight a square to move back to the center on c7. But c7 is no great place for the knight as well. Now we have rook d1 hitting the queen, and the queen goes to c8. A very bad square, by the way. Very inactive. It's interfering with the rooks. It's going to c8 because on b6 it might be exposed. On c7 it will get in the way of the knight. I suppose he could consider queen e8 as well. So queen to c8, white has a space advantage. Although it's a symmetrical pawn structure here, white has the advantage. Now he plays c4. And this gains more space. He could play c5, maybe create ultimately an outpost for his pieces on d6 along the open file. Knight c7. Notice how passively placed black is. Rook a8, rook f8, knight c7, queen c8. This is a guy who became world champion, Max Uwe. Yet here in this game, he's looking very, very passive. Knight c7 and now queen c3. This, I think, was no coincidence. White wanted to get the c-pawn out in front of the queen, then develop the queen to c3. Black could play f6, but it weakens the king side, so instead he plays bishop f6. And now white could play e5. That would liberate this bishop on h7, which is really like a spectator. In many London systems, one of the best ways to play against that piece is to simply shut it down with a structure like e4 and f3. White can play e4 and f3, and then activate his own bishop to a new diagonal, like h3 or bishop f1. So bishop f6, knight e5, keeping that pawn on e4 to keep the bishop on h7 shut down. Rook d8, black seeking to relieve his cramped position by exchanging pieces. Bishop f3, I was just talking about this now. This was an idea where Petrosian wanted to play bishop h5. He really, really thought that this idea would put tremendous pressure, but I think that black's able to get out of this with this maneuver knight e8. By playing knight e8, this would enable, sometimes potential defense with a move knight to d6. But in any case, the knight is getting out of the way. The rook is now gone to d8. Now here white could play bishop h5. That's an interesting try. But instead he exchanges rooks and takes over the file. So it's like a kind of accumulation of advantages Petrosian taking advantage of here. Queen takes rook d1. You got the open file. We've got slightly more active pieces and we've got slightly more space. These things are starting to add up, yet white is not winning at this point. And I think with perfect defense, black can probably hold on. c5, I think we're starting to think about possible outposts for pieces on d6. Maybe a knight in the long term, maybe a rook could go to d6. But more importantly, he's just fixing that knight. not allowing the knight to get back into the game via d6. So now Uwe has to think about a new route for his knight, and he plays a5, activating the rook on a8 from its original square. Bishop g2. New plan. I think the new plan is going to be to come back to f1 and activate on this diagonal f1, c4. ab, ab. The rook file is open, but there's actually very little that black can do. He doesn't really have any squares where he can penetrate or do any kind of damage. So it's more like a symbolic activity for the rook on a8. Still better than nothing for black. And now rook to d8, kind of counterintuitive in a way. He gives up on the a file, says, I'm just going to trade pieces. I don't think you have enough to win. I'm just slightly worse in space, but I can hold this. Perhaps that was the case. Rook takes d8, queen takes d8, and now queen c2. The thing is here, I mean, we could maneuver knight c4, maybe knight a5, or knight to d6, bishop back to f1, f3, the bishop on h7 is kind of a spectator. It looks symmetrical, it looks like white doesn't have that much, but it is a kind of lasting advantage in this position. And now something strange happens. Knight c7 is fine. He's going to activate the knight to b5. Bishop f1, we talked about this, activating that piece, while the one on h7 remains kind of a spectator. Notice the point of queen c2, prophylactic move, defending e4. Again, Petrosian very, very big on strong point. He will probably play f3 at some point, but that involves weakening the king side. So now knight to b5, f4, and then king f8, starting to centralize the king for the endgame. King f2, both sides centralizing king for the endgame. White is slightly better, but not winning. I don't think there's enough to win this position unless black makes a mistake here. Kind of a typical result of an opening where white is slightly better. So again, Petrosian versus Uwe, Zurich 1953. This is the move that I just don't understand. Bishop takes e5. It was like a lazy move, like a mental lapse, kind of underestimating Petrosian's chances here. But I think that this move was the key mistake. With this move, white's advantage goes from a slight advantage to a clear advantage because that dark squared bishop is just way too strong to kind of handle here for black. Bishop takes e5, and now bishop takes e5. White with a massive, massive space advantage, and he's also got the bishop pair, which is going to be very valuable going into this endgame. Despite the symmetrical pawns, the bishops would rather have imbalance in the pawn structure, but still, we've done a series here, I've done a series here on chesslecture.com about Fischer and the two bishops. And also, if you'd like to check out that series, I think it complements this Petrosian on the King's Indian Attack series, because Fischer actually was excellent with the two bishops, and there's one or two examples where he was using them also in the King's Indian Attack. Despite the symmetry of the position, I think white still has a massive advantage here. So it was a really big mistake. Uwe giving up the bishop pair and now playing f6, hoping to maybe reactivate the bishop back to g8, which is not unheard of. Bishop to b2, king e7, and now bishop to c4. That's what we've been aiming for. White had a bad bishop on g2, typical King's Indian, but it comes back to life. It's a very slow process, closed position, slowly out to h3, or maybe back to f1. Back to f1, activating on this diagonal. And white has a lot of potential now to open up the king side, g4, h4, g5, and I think the key is the dark squares. We're going to start to take over the dark squares, and that's how white breaks through. Watch the rest of the game. Bishop g6, king e3. First things first, centralizing the king, making sure this knight doesn't get to a good outpost on d4. And now bishop f7. And the one most important thing that we don't want to let happen here with white, we do not want black to trade the bishops. What we don't want is to end up with like bad bishop against knight. We really don't want our bishop pair to be traded off at all, in fact, because they complement each other very well. So that's the one thing, although black cannot play e5 here without dropping a pawn. g4, and again, h4, g5 looks like a serious threat opening up the dark squares. Queen c7, kind of a passive, like, waiting move. I think he's looking at this diagonal, though. e5, cracking open the dark squares. This is a very problematic move for black. f5 is not possible. Taking leaves black with a bad structure, so he just repeats moves here. Queen d8, and then pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and several things have happened now. The pawn structure, I was saying, it was symmetrical before. Now it's slightly imbalanced, which favors the two bishops. And our pawns are more outside. So we have H, G, and F against H, F, and E, which means that we can create a passed pawn by playing H4 and G5, which with this bishop pair should be basically decisive. H4, knight C7. He's got a good square for the knight on D5. Admittedly, this is going to make it a little bit tougher for white, but that is not going to stop that passed pawn, and I don't think that this is enough. Queen C3, attacking the dark squares. Now knight D5 simply loses a pawn, but he doesn't have any way to protect F6. Other than knight E8, which is, I think, this possibility of knight E8 in this position, it's just too passive. I think that black is just going to get overrun here with G5. So he decides to sacrifice a pawn. Knight D5, it's a reasonable practical try. Bishop takes D5, and then activate the queen. And white has to be careful about perpetual checks, because his king doesn't have any kind of haven. Queen takes F6 check, King E8. And now this is the careful part of the game. They reach move 40, and in the old days, when this was played, in 1953, which was a very important tournament, they had adjournments, which means that the game was stopped at move 40, a secret move was sealed in an envelope, and then the players, with their friends, could analyze the position and continue it the next day or several days later. So I think in a practical game, by modern standards, black would have good chances of drawing this by perpetual check or something like that. But Petrosian, his helpers, and his friends were able to actually analyze this endgame down to the last detail. And he found a way to make sure that his king was constantly sheltered from checks. And he goes on to win the game. Queen H8 check, King D7, Queen G7, double attack, creating a lot of problems. And now Bishop F6 with the threat of Queen H8 and Queen D8 mate in just 3 moves. Now there's a check, okay, probing, and then going back. It's very important to be patient in the endgame. Petrosian, an excellent example of patience. Queen D1, Queen H8 check, King D7. He could trade queens here with Queen D4 check. I have the feeling it's probably winning, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm a little concerned that if Queen D4 check, Queen takes D4, recapture on D4, black has the move H5, which might just hold on. So instead of that check, he plays Queen to B8. And this was obviously very carefully analyzed by the assistance of Petrosian. He's threatening the B7 pawn, but the queen also protects F4 from checks by white. You'll see here. Queen check, Bishop D2, Queen G1 check, King D3, Queen F1 check, King C2, Queen to A6. At that point, he has just a few more checks. But he will eventually run out. So instead, he played Queen A6, guarding the pawn. But this queen is very badly placed. Bishop on F7. This London system bishop has been inactive throughout the game. And white is able to break through and win. This is a key move, H5. Disabling black from playing H5 himself. And now Queen A2 check, King D3, another king walk, Queen B1, King E2. There is no perpetual check. King F2, Queen D4 check, Bishop E3, and now he takes a pawn. But at this point now, things become clear. Queen F8, the bishop is nearly trapped. There aren't a lot of checks, just one check. King G3 on the dark square, and now Queen F6. And this is the point where basically the game is decided. Queen D6 check, King C8, and Bishop D4. And this is a very nasty situation because black has only one queen move, which is to trade queens. And although the material is equal, Queen D8, Queen takes D8, King takes D8, bam, Bishop G7. And this is the deciding move. Material is equal, but we're winning the H pawn, and white will have 2 connected passed pawns. Now, while if there were only 2 pawns against 2 pawns, it would probably be a draw. Black could sacrifice the bishop. In this case, that's not the case. There are extra pawns on the board. If black decides to sacrifice his bishop for the last 2 pawns on the king side, there'll still be a pawn remaining on the queen side. so black is unable to defend this against the connected passed pawns. He plays this to try to trade off the queenside pawn, but it's too slow. Bishop takes h6, b6, takes, king h4. But notice how far away this king is from the advancing g and h pawns here for white. So there's no way that king is going to get back to the king side in time to allow black to sacrifice his bishop for the two connected passed pawns. And at this point, Uwe gave up the ghost and resigned. Again, this was Petrosian versus Max Uwe from the Zurich Candidates Tournament 1953. I think an excellent example of how to play with white in the King's Indian attack, and quite a strong opponent at that. I'm International Master William Paschall. This is part 1 of Petrosian on the King's Indian attack. Thanks for joining us here at chesslecture.com. Bye-bye.